I'm Karina Robinson, and I'm master of the Worshipful Company of International Bankers, a livery company, a very modern livery company in the City of London. One of the things that's been crucial for my year is the theme of open door, open city. Basically what that means is diversity and inclusion. We want the best talent in the world to come to the City of London and be fulfilled in what they do there. That's where the innovation comes from that will save the world post-coronavirus, because the truth is finance is always central to everything that happens. This podcast series of Talk and Toast with the great and the good in the city is sponsored by Streets Consulting. Streets has done incredible work in the diversity and inclusion space, but also in communications. And their clients go from entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, medium-sized entrepreneurs, to HSBCs and some of the largest companies in this world. And we're very, very proud to be sponsored by them. Our guests today are two people who stand out for their LBGT campaigning, but also for their excellence in what they do. So Inga Beale, Dame Inga Beale, who was the CEO of Lloyds, the Lloyds insurance market, which covers the whole world, and has now got a portfolio of roles. And Antonio Simoes, who when we first set up this interview, he was the head of global private banking at HSBC, but he's now the head of Europe for Santander Bank and enjoying his gardening leave. They're partners because, you know, the Talk and Toast breakfast, we always had the partners of those talking. Their partners prefer to keep a low profile, and instead they kindly agreed to come on together. Part of that reason is to highlight the LBGT agenda, or as Inga said very clearly in an interview, let me quote, "Let's use words that people are uncomfortable with, like lesbian, gay." You were both at a World Economic Forum, and I think it was 4 years ago. Now, Antonio said at that leadership forum at Davos, most of the leadership at Davos is too male, too white, too straight, and too elite. Those words surely can still be used for the City of London. What, Inga, do you see as holding back change, and what can we do about it?
There's been an enormous change going on in the city. If I think back to when I started, which was 1982, it feels a very different place today, but there is still more work to do. We have had lots of the financial services company, the banks have spent billions probably, the insurers a bit late to the party, but they've been spending money on trying to crack this diversity and inclusion nut, and no one has done it yet. I don't know the absolute answer to how we really make a difference. We've just got to try everything we can. I think most of the organizations now, they've got the right policies in place. They're making sure that they're being equal in their treatment of people at work. To me, there's something more to it. And I've been grappling with this for many years. There's something about, I think, behaviors at the moment. And we've uncovered in the insurance market anyway, that there are some perhaps still inappropriate behaviors going on. And that means they can be quite subtle actually. People, it's very difficult to describe them, but if you've had somebody say something inappropriate to you, or they've done something that makes you just feel embarrassed or that you don't want to be there, that's what we've got to try and wipe out, because some of this is done purely unconsciously. Sometimes it's microaggressions that people don't even know they're saying things that are slightly aggressive to one type of person rather than another. It's a highly complicated area, but there are more and more people doing work on this. I know some of the academic institutions are doing it, and I hope that we can actually come out with a better understanding, because it is down to the human behavior, and we all can play a part in breaking down those barriers. And actually, that's why I sort of go back to those words I said. Let's start using words and having conversation about some of the issues that normally we feel uncomfortable having.
Can I just interject before going to Antonio and make a little pitch, just a very quick little pitch for a new institute we're co-founding at the London School of Economics, and it builds on what you're saying, Inga. It's called the Inclusion Initiative. I'm co-founding it with Professor Grace Lorden, and we're looking at behavioral science and data, because as you say, it comes back to behaviors at this point. But that's the sort of end of my pitch, because I really want to ask Antonio, do you think, Antonio, yes, we've made great advances, but will COVID-19 be a bad influence or a good influence?
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you for the invitation. It's a really, really important topic. First, I would say I agree with Inga. This is a really complex topic, and most people are still fundamentally uncomfortable with difference, and it may be difference, gender, ethnicity, it may be your accent. It's not just the traditional how we think about D&I. It's just people don't feel comfortable with someone being different. And to your question, Karina, I think right now we observe history of the last few years and decades. Whenever there's fear, when people feel under threat, like right now, typically intolerance increases. There's an element of intolerance that creeps in. So I think the answer to your question is not straightforward. I think on one hand, this fear response, this sense of self-protection and survival. In some cases, there's traditional prejudices that come in, some of the old patterns of behavior that Inga was just talking about. And yesterday, I was talking to Debbie Wasco, who you may know. She's the good friend and the founder of Albright, which is an organization that supports women in business. And we were talking about how couples right now are renegotiating some of the roles given the lockdown. So who does homeschooling, who does this or that. And you probably read Sheryl Sandberg's article on the double shift. So she had talked about the double shift, which is a concept other people have coined. And this is the double shift, particularly from a gender perspective. So that's a negative impact. On the other hand, the reason why I don't think this is straightforward is that we've also seen the compassionate response to the crisis, right? Everything from NHS and health workers around the world. People are being a bit more thoughtful, a bit more tolerant, talking to neighbors that they probably never talked before. And so I see an opportunity. And for me, the example of flexibility and what remote working is allowing us to do, I think there's an opportunity for us to rethink interactions at work and at home and actually have more tolerance towards each other. So I don't think it's probably too soon to tell, but I think there is the risk that we become less tolerant with some of that fear. I'm hopeful that we become a bit more compassionate and therefore a bit more tolerant of each other. And therefore, back to your question about 4 years ago, that we progress more the D&I agenda over the next couple of years.
Could I just actually lead on from that question? Do you think leadership needs to be different in this new era, which is being ushered in?
So I believe so, actually. I've been saying this for a while. If I go back to even the global financial crisis, and if I think of our industry, so in banking, I think the way we think about leadership needs to be different. So think about the response to the crisis so far. So we have, if I take our example at HSBC, like most other people, we probably started a bit earlier because of Asia. The first bit of the reaction to the crisis was all hands to the deck. We were pulling together, everybody trying to sort of work from home. We have around 200,000 people working from home right now. So that was the first reaction. Then afterwards was all thinking about clients, supporting them. In my case, as you said, I'm leading the private bank. So it was all about the market volatility. How do we support clients through this? And also thinking about risk, capital, all the other good things about banking. But to your question about leadership, what I've now seen is that a lot of what we are now facing with our teams is post that initial period, the challenge really is how to sustain that energy, how a lot of people have been impacted themselves, their families. There's an element of humanity and compassion, using the word I used earlier, that is needed. And for many of us that believe that that's the right way to lead a business anyway, I think the crisis is demonstrating that that's what we need now, and that's what you need going forward. So more sense of empathy, bigger sense of vulnerability, linking to the topic of diversity and inclusion. How do you bring more of yourself to discussions when you're doing it like this over over Zoom or over the phone rather than being able to do it face to face. So I think this model of leadership is something I believe is the right model of leadership anyway. I think this crisis is forcing that change and demonstrating that's what we need going forward.
Inga, I wanted to move to the insurance industry, which, you know, you pointed out it was a bit of a laggard compared to some of the other city industries. How do you think it's coping with coronavirus? And, you know, obviously there's been quite a bit of criticism about different sectors of the insurance industry, and are they actually fulfilling their commitments or trying to sort of weasel out of them? What's your view of the industry as a whole?
Well, if I think about Lloyds specifically, because it's a very physical marketplace, they've got some unique challenges because a lot of the business is done face to face. Now, when I was at Lloyds, we introduced electronic trading, so a platform that enabled people to actually do business electronically. Thank goodness that was in place, because now the market has been closed for weeks, they've been actually able to continue trading. And what it's done, I think, to a lot of the people working in the market has opened their eyes to a new way of working, which is fantastic. And after years and years and years of trying to push and modernize, it's happened just within a couple of months. So that's fantastic. But on the business side and the insurance policies, there are huge fights going on at the moment, because a lot of the insurers have said, sorry, COVID-19 is not covered in your business interruption policy. You may be losing profits during this time, but we can't pay out, it's not covered. And there are other examples of that. So there are some class actions at the moment. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But the interesting argument really is, well, insurers aren't paying out for this loss of profits for these businesses suffering. Then it goes to the government to basically bail out or help companies paying for their employee base and things like that. So then it all ends up with the taxpayer at the end of the day. So it's sort of, what is the purpose of that insurance piece if it's not going to be stepping in when things go really wrong? Now, the regulators are all over this. The regulators have been asking insurers if, in a worst case scenario, if they were to end up paying out for a lot of these COVID-19 losses, what would that impact be? Because the regulator wants to ensure that everyone remains solvent and there's enough money to obviously pay the policyholders and keep the companies afloat. And I do believe that there is enough there. The solvency regime has recently been introduced that's very, very much tougher for insurers. And I think that will ensure that there's a robust, healthy insurance sector, regardless of what happens with these class actions.
Do you know, it does remind me of 2008, where, you know, everything is done to keep the banks afloat. Right now, the banks, because the regulators have been in there, they're much more steady. They've got bigger reserves. They're more resilient. So now it almost seems as though the tail is wagging the dog, and we're doing everything we can to make sure the insurance firms can survive. But actually, as you say, in the end, there's this socialization of losses, because it always comes down to the taxpayer. There just seems something slightly wrong in that model.
It is, and it's interesting. Having done insurance all over the world, we've often cited the government as being one of our serious competitors, because often, and particularly some of the terrorist attacks that have happened over the past few decades, they've highlighted that there wasn't enough money in the financial network, or at least the insurance sector, to pay for some of these huge losses. So it had to fall on the government. And we've seen a similar scheme around flood insurance in the UK. And therefore, the government is sort of being the backstop around a lot of this. Now, that might be the way it goes forward when you've got these massive exposures. But I think we do have to think seriously about the purpose of what the insurance product is and how it contributes, because it does contribute enormously, actually, to the financial well-being of an economy.
Looking at one of your board seats at the moment, you're on the board of London First. And recently there was an excellent article in the FT pointing out that this could be the end of the mega city. Now, I think the end was a bit of an exaggeration, but do you actually see this as one of the threats to London?
London First, we have actually been changing our strategy, because when it was started, it was an association of businesses, and it was all about physical things. It was about getting rail infrastructure working, airports built. as our last strategy session last year, we said, actually, we've got to think of London in a very different way. We've got to actually think of virtual connectivity. We said, we've got to make sure that 5G is equipped everywhere, that actually we are as well connected within the city in a sort of physical way as we are with a lot of the workers who actually work outside of London. So we started thinking in a different way about London already last year. And we were also thinking a lot about the death of the high street, because people, you know, they were staying in their homes, they're ordering everything online, and the high streets are dying. So we had a lot of new ideas coming on board anyway. This, I suppose, has just made us think even more about what will London be afterwards. Without a doubt, there are businesses saying, we don't need as much real estate. We can see that perhaps 30% of the time, people can be working virtually. They do not need to commute in. I've heard people say how lovely it would be not to spend an hour or two commuting in every day. I have to say, though, that people's behaviours do tend to go back quite easily to what we actually enjoy. And I'll give you a little example. My husband's in Zurich at the moment. Shame he wouldn't join the call, but you know, he's in Zurich at the moment. They've opened up. He showed me a scene on Sunday of the lake around Zurich, closed completely during lockdown, not a person to be seen. Now they're all out doing exactly the same sorts of things as they were before. So my point is, people do sort of bounce back, and I don't believe it's the death of the megacity. I think if people enjoy coming into the city, they enjoy the meeting people, they get paid, this is where the money is, a lot of the city will come back to life.
There's another larger question, which is, and this is something that's been sort of in the works for a while, which is that our capitalist system isn't quite working. You know, the whole Washington consensus and all of that, we've realized, okay, so it isn't working. So are we now looking, and the burning platform is, of course, coronavirus, are we looking at a new paradigm, a stakeholder capitalism that will actually be implemented?
I don't know whether the COVID-19 situation will actually be the spark for that, because there was already a lot of work and talk being done. And I was particularly involved in something that the British Academy is working on and looking at the purpose of the corporation. And we know we've had some fine words from some of the leading CEOs in the world about how capitalism needs to be different. And I believe that this will create a change in terms of what is the purpose of the corporation, and it cannot be just for profit for the shareholders. I believe the employee voice is getting much stronger. We've seen the CEO of many big global firms being put on the spot by employees to have an opinion about something, to sort of enter the world stage of debate about some hot topics. Therefore, the employees are having a much louder voice. We're having a requirement now as non-executive directors to make sure we know what our workforce want, that we're engaging with them, that we actually understand and we really fully represent them. And then, of course, we've got the customer. And that, of course, I think fits very nicely also in with the diversity and inclusion aspect, because we need people working in our businesses that reflect our customers so that we're actually delivering what they want. So I believe the world is slowly changing. I don't think there's going to be a rapid move to this because of the crisis we're in, but I do believe the talk about purpose of the corporation, many people realizing it's not just all about profit, that is going to be a change in the future.
Thank you, Inga. Antonio, turning to you, you know, as you mentioned earlier, there you were at HSBC with its huge Asian exposure when the coronavirus hit in the West. What were the biggest challenges you faced over that time? And obviously not talking about some of the people challenges you were talking about, but what were some of the other challenges you faced?
Thank you. So we probably started earlier, as I mentioned, simply because, and it's interesting, I was at Davos earlier in the year, and I don't think a single person mentioned COVID-19, and that was, of course, at the end of January. So I don't think people saw it coming, but at that point, nobody saw it coming, but at that point, China, Hong Kong, many other places in Asia were already getting ready. So I think the biggest challenge for me personally as a CEO of the business was absolutely business continuity. I think some of the elements of, we've all been there in terms of all the plans that we have in place for if something catastrophe happens. And actually, I think most businesses, clearly ours, not only survive, but actually perform really well. Inga, you were mentioning the point around some I guess, progress that had taken years to actually to approve different things. I had been working on an iPhone sort of WhatsApp way to communicate with our clients for over a year and a half, and in 2 weeks we approved it and started interacting with clients that way. So I think that the first big challenge was absolutely business continuity and making sure that things just work. And I'm really thankful to all of our employees for the extraordinary mobilization and the fact that we were able to not skip a beat and continue to run the business. The second, I touched on this briefly earlier, but there was a huge challenge around clients. Clearly, if you take the private banking business, a lot of margin calls, a lot of volatility in the markets. You saw this. This is true for all of our clients globally, because markets on all types of assets were moving and swinging up and down quite quickly. It was very important to be very close to clients when you can't be physically close to clients. So the business continuity was important. So the second biggest challenge we faced was how to support clients in this environment, particularly from an investment perspective, and more broadly as a bank, all the customers that are actually suffering the impacts of COVID-19. And then I talked a bit about the human element of it earlier. That has been one of the biggest challenges for all of us, but how do you keep in touch with people on a one-on-one basis as a team? How do you keep some of that humanity that I mentioned? That has been, for me, one of the biggest challenges when you are basically stuck at home on sort of death by Zoom, on call after call after call. So how do you maintain some of that water cooler kind of, are you okay type of speaking to someone in a break? How do you maintain that? I had many of my team members, completely different family situations. People had just started, moved across the world to start here in London, and then found themselves completely alone, isolated in a small flat. Hong Kong, Singapore, other places, as you may know, people live typically in very small spaces. They have to be sort of confined to their own apartment for 2 to 3 months now. So taking care of our own people has probably been my other biggest challenge. So I'd say business continuity, taking care of clients, and then our own people.
One of the things you've obviously mentioned is the sort of speeding up of digitalization. Now, that won't be the only change we'll see in banking. I mean, if you had to sort of put your thinker's cap on about 2 to 5 years down the line, in what way will banking look different?
So it's a great question. And of course, things are moving so quickly that 2 to 5 years is actually difficult to predict at the moment. I would say a lot of what we're seeing is actually an acceleration of existing trends. So I don't think we should also make all of this about COVID-19. I think COVID-19 has triggered, as I said earlier, things that would have taken a year and a half now have been approved over 2 or 3 weeks. But I think some of that were just existing trends. What I see there, probably 4 areas to mention, and I see some tensions in that. The first one is digital and how the way we interact with customers will be different. It's an acceleration of the remote interactions, but also the fact that we as banks particularly have very expensive multi-channel distribution models that include everything from the branches to the contact centers, etc. We will need to rethink all of that, even because the clients themselves will not want to come to the branches in the same way and interact with us as they did before. But the tension there is that we will still need some element of physical presence and interaction. So what is that in a post-COVID-19 world? So that's number one. Number two, and particularly for us here in the UK and across Europe and the developed world, the pressure on costs. So the industry has been struggling with this for a long time, but we will need to have a leaner cost base, streamline more processes. But the tension there is that you need to do that while making sure that the model is resilient. So something I said kind of a few minutes ago is that this business continuity will be even more important. So yes, we need to cut costs, but not compromise on resilience. Number three, how do we support customers? Very important going forward, but we also need to be realistic that there's a risk management component of this. So 2 to 5 years down the road, a lot of our clients will not exist. A lot of the companies within our societies will not exist. So for us in banking, how do you do you balance that social responsibility of supporting businesses, but equally knowing from a risk management perspective how to manage that so that you also protect the capital of the bank and are able to support everybody else that will survive. And then the fourth point, and I really liked what Inga just said about purpose. This is not a COVID-19 point, but having corporations that are purpose-driven, that we as leaders are making purpose-driven choices, that we behave in the right way with a different leadership model is absolutely critical. I've said this back in 2008, 2009, that I thought some of these changes in the culture of the industry and leadership models, that they would have changed back in 2008, 2009. They haven't really. Will this be a further catalyst? I believe so. I think the tension there is it needs to be more than just words. I think at the moment there's also a bit of this, I think I read something about corona washing in the same way that we look at green washing. I think this can't be, oh, I'm a really purpose-driven leader and I'm supporting it. The actions that we take will be much more important. And I think there will be a bit, like with diversity and inclusion, interestingly, a bit of this fatigue of people saying, yes, you talk about purpose, but look at the actions of your corporation. So I think the tension there is companies and leaders that are truly purpose-driven. I think the actions that those companies and those individuals take over the next few weeks and months are going to be a great test of, are they really committed to that societal purpose that I believe is the right one.
Going to one of the after effects of this is, every day you hear about a new government scheme to support small businesses, self-employed, whatever, and you've got this all over the world. And companies are issuing all this debt as well because they don't have enough in their reserves. I mean, basically, you have trillions of dollars of debt being created all over the world. And I mentioned at the beginning, the City of London is great at coming up with new instruments, managing things. What is going to happen with all those trillions of dollars of debt?
So it's a great question. It's a real problem, right? As you say, there is a combination of sort of payment holidays and other schemes that are for individuals and companies being created, and government schemes of support, so the combination of both. And when those loans, most of them, will revert back to normal commercial terms, and that's what many people don't realize. It's the question that they end. A lot of these schemes end from a support perspective, and a lot of those schemes have been designed in the way that they revert back to normal commercial terms. And even if interest rates are close to zero or negative in most places around the world, it will be it's a serious issue. Some of those companies will not be able to survive, and how we deal with that is something that worries me personally. I think one aspect, and there's been already quite a lot of debate and quite a lot of good sort of intellectual debate around this, is how much broader sort of debt for equity swap idea can we have, both on the government side and also on the private side. So on the government side, that's very obvious. We talked right at the beginning of governments coming to the rescue of banks back in 2008. Actually, it was quite limited. It was to sort of a small number of banks, and we didn't have a lot of that intervention beyond that. We thought we would have, but we didn't have much more beyond that. I think this time around, we capitalists need to be ready for much more government intervention from that perspective, but sort of at a large level, hopefully not banks. I think banks are in a stronger position, but for other corporations and even down to smaller businesses, debt to equity swaps where governments actually become shareholders in companies, and we need to think through the implications of that. But also the same happening with banks. We actually wiping out debt in some cases or converting it into equity. So I think that's one area. But to finish on a slightly more positive note, I agree with something Inga and Karina, you said earlier. The banks themselves and the financial system is now in a much more solid position. So despite the impact of those issues with debt, I believe the financial system actually is more resilient, much more than it was clearly in 2008. And so we have the ability to cope with that. I think the system is more resilient, and therefore, even if or when those things happen in terms of non-performing loans and debt that's not repaid, etc., that the financial system is robust enough, particularly the banks, to withstand that.
For Inga, because I mean, Antonio has raised that interesting point about the government. The government becomes much more entrenched in companies, and that sort of reminds me of Germany, of Switzerland, well, Germany more than anywhere else. And you've spent some time there, working there. What is your view? Do you see it as a great disadvantage to have the government more involved in the private sector?
Well, I also lived in France, where we see an awful lot of that as well. So yes, I've lived in, worked and lived in Germany and France. I don't think it's necessarily a great thing. I am fundamentally believe in, entrepreneurship, and I think what I've seen over the past is any time regulators get really tough, and I've had this conversation in insurance for many, many years, regulation gets tough and everyone goes, oh gosh, this is going to be so difficult to get through. What it does is it actually encourages more and more creativity, because people think, right, sort of keeps people on their toes and they think of another way around it. But sort of state ownership, I don't really believe in, but I do believe that government should make sure that the economy is robust. How much you balance external foreign investors coming in to own your assets and things, I don't know. I mean, the UK is in such a situation now, for instance, in insurance, that hardly any of the major insurers in the UK are actually British firms anymore. So there's all sorts of things, and you go to another country, like say France, and you'll see state ownership and the control over ownership of French companies being handled in a very different way. So there are many different approaches. I'm all for actually private sector rather than state run.
On a more personal note, Inga, your husband is a jeweler. I mean, superb jeweler. I mean, I wish I could afford his amazing concoctions, which are more like really works of art than anything else. But do you think, because he comes from such a different profession from yours, do you think when it comes to supporting you, it helps or it hinders?
I found it incredibly helpful to have a partner who's not from financial services. Before I married my husband, and we've been married for 6 years, I was actually with a woman for 12 years, and she was a singer-songwriter. So again, a very, very different profession. Both of them very, very creative. I admire creativity because I'm so into numbers and maths and things. I sort of look at what these artists design and build and draw and create, and I'm just in awe of them. So there's that I think really helps. So I totally admire what my husband does. I can't do it. Equally, if I have an issue, a work issue, and I don't often talk about things with him, but if I do, he comes at it from a completely different angle, and I go, why didn't I think of that? It's right back to the inclusion topic that we've been talking about. Get ideas from other types of people, and it makes you see things for, I think, the better.
So Antonio, how are you going to respond to that? Because your husband was in, I believe, private equity and is now dealing more with your children. But I mean, that's a pretty similar profession and a pretty similar, perhaps, view of the world than you have.
Well, yes and no, definitely not a singer-songwriter. I can't compete with that. But he's first much smarter than me. It's been very successful, and he was in hedge funds actually. And but he had his own company, and so in a way, he's much more of an entrepreneur, where I have been more sort of managing large businesses. So it's actually, we come at it from very different perspectives, and I agree with Inga that it's really helpful to have a partner that brings that different perspective. When we moved back from Hong Kong, where we lived almost 10 years ago, and we decided to have children, so he decided to focus on that, which was his choice and our decision as a family. But he definitely keeps me grounded. And right now, maybe because of COVID-19 and the fact that we're all at home, I have probably a different appreciation for some of the difficulties of being sort of a parent to two small children throughout the day. And actually I get to enjoy them kind of 24/7. And I think one outcome of this that's been good for us as a family is that I think we're finding different ways of supporting each other, where probably we had fallen on to a sort of specific kind of, you do this, you do that, kind of, you do this in the morning, you do this in the evening. I think we're coming out of this as a stronger partnership, because like everybody else, we've had to adapt to a different reality.
One last question for each of you. Antonio, would you go first? Which is, for that young person who's considering a career in the city and is worried that their sexuality will affect their career, because they look and they think, where are those role models? There are only a few of them up there at the top. What bit of advice would you give to them?
It's a good question. I think if I step back, the discussion we've just had about what's happening right now, I think how the world reacts to this crisis is going to be a really big test for all of us. And if, as I believe and hope, we come out of this as more thoughtful and more compassionate and more resilient, and with more kindness and compassion, which is that point I was saying, rather than fear, I think that will have an impact on tolerance, and hopefully a positive impact on diversity and inclusion, including LGBT and the LGBT community more broadly. So my advice would be, I think right now, if I were, let's say 20, I think there's an unprecedented opportunity, actually. There's the potential to shape something really positive coming out of this, from a banking perspective, to be more customer focused, as Inga and I were saying earlier, more purpose driven, to really have more sort of responsibility towards society. So I think the watch out for a 20-year-old, and definitely this would have been true for me back then, is that don't let fear get in the way of that. Don't let any fear or insecurity get in the way of optimism and get in the way of your own confidence.
Thank you. Inga?
Well, both Antonio and I have been out role models, being both recognised by Outstanding and the Financial Times at that time for being role models for the LGBT community. And I think we have many, many more, not quite an abundance, but we have a lot more role models from that community. That should be truly inspiring for the young people today. And I would just say, the time is different. Please don't go back in the closet. Be out, be proud, be who you are, because guaranteed you can have a fantastic career in the city.
Thank you both very much. I mean, you are outstanding role models in so many ways, and to so many of us. What can I say? This has been one of the most inspiring interviews we've done in the Talk and Toast, and it represents everything that Talk and Toast was about, which is about diversity and inclusion. What a huge difference it can make to companies, and especially to companies in the city that perhaps arrived a bit late in the game, but are doing their best to come up with innovative solutions to it, and hopefully a better world. Many thanks to you both.